A local physician will reveal his findings on NutraSweet on national TV tonight. Most people use NutraSweet or aspartame-based products to help them lose weight. But Dr. Ralph Walton of the Western Health Care System, who researched NutraSweet for 12 years, claims the artificial sweetener actually does the opposite.
So I think the bottom line is the more NutraSweet you take in, the greater your appetitive drive, the greater your drive towards overeating.
And he says that's because NutraSweet may lower the levels of appetite suppressants in the brain. And to hear more about Dr. Walton's research on NutraSweet, watch 60 Minutes tonight at 7 here on TV 27.
So, Ralph Walton, what's your favorite baseball team?
You know,
you're going to learn a lot about this from this answer.
I don't have one because I'm not a baseball fan. I hate to admit that.
It's a good thing Don Greenhouse isn't here. He would have left. So, where are you from?
Oh gosh, that's hard to say. I've lived in so many different places. I was born in England, came to this country when I was 9 years old, then lived in Rochester. Then I was in, lived in Rochester quite a few years. Then I was on the faculty of the medical school in Rochester. So that was home for quite some time. Then came to Jamestown. Then when Jamestown General Hospital closed, moved to Ohio. Was in Ohio for 17 years, then came back here. And now I'm a resident of Chautauqua.
We're glad you are. What'd your mom and dad do for a living?
My parents were Holocaust survivors. My dad began his career before they had to leave, before Hitler. He wrote plays. He was a playwright and had one play in production, but then Hitler came to power, so they had to flee. They literally went with no papers, with the Gestapo running after them. They went from country to country without papers. Finally wound up in a DP camp, and my dad felt that it was his war, and he managed to enlist in the British Army. So for the duration of World War II, he was a soldier, a British soldier, with a heavy German accent. His name was Kurt Wartenberger. The British Army suggested that he anglicize his name. It wasn't really safe for a British soldier to have the name Kurt Wartenberger. So Kurt Wartenberger became Kenneth Walton. They always assumed that that name change by Army order applied to me. But I was actually born before that Army name change. And I recently, not that recently, but a few years back, learned that that wasn't legal. That is, my name technically is still Wartenberger because my birth certificate reads Wartenberger. But all my licenses, etc., are under the name Walton, so I just leave it alone and don't talk about that very much. So I'm an alias.
How did you get Social Security?
I have immigration, I have naturalization papers, and those naturalization papers say Walton, even though my birth certificate says Wartenberger.
Sometimes I'm sorry, you have to bring in your birth certificate.
Yeah, I always say I don't have one, but I do have one, but it's the wrong name.
I love this story. So, where in Germany were your parents?
They were from Breslau, which now is Wrocław, Poland. You know, the borders kept being redrawn. They were German. I mean, it was Germany throughout their lifetimes. But then, after the war, it became Poland.
Now, did they feel a sense that they had to flee, or were they actually were they placed in camps?
No, they had to flee. There was a warrant for my father's arrest for sabotage against the German government. Trumped up. He'd written some things anti-Nazi, and so they wanted him badly. And he said, wherever recently went through some of his material, and he wrote that. Whenever the Nazis came for him, he was somewhere else. And they couldn't find him. And he literally then ran through the streets and got on trains and went from country to country illegally until he finally wound up in a DP camp.
Did he continue to write plays at all afterwards?
He tried. I remember going around with him when I was a boy. He tried to... I went with him when he went to producer of some films, and he just felt that he didn't have the facility with the English language that he had with, he actually wrote very, very well. He was a very articulate man, very eloquent, but he just didn't have the confidence to write in English, so he gave it up. But when I was a boy, he was writing. On the table there was always scripts, and he was creating plays, but nothing was ever purchased or materialized out of it.
Did he watch movies that were German movies? Was he?
He hated everything German. No, he wouldn't buy a German product. His mother, as a matter of fact, did survive too. Most of the family was wiped out. My mother's whole family, her parents, they were all wiped out at Auschwitz. And most of my father's family was also. But his parents survived by going to Shanghai. And my grandmother spoke only German, and my dad was always very angry with her that she wouldn't speak English. He'd speak to her in English and she'd answer in German. He just was very, very anti-German.
I just saw a documentary on Leni Riefenstahl and that whole almost bipolar reaction afterwards, whether the relationship with Hitler and non-relationship with Hitler, professional and non-professional, all of that stuff. And did he ever talk about the arts at all, about what was going on?
Oh yeah, I mean, he did speak about his belief that Germany was a very, very cultured place before Hitler. And German Jews did very, very well, actually. They were, in the arts and in the professions. It was a very cultured community. And he did speak about that at length, yeah, sure.
So he's in the British Army.
Yep.
Now he's got an anglicized name, but he obviously with an accent. Did he feel discriminated against? My God, I can't imagine what this is like here.
He actually caused a panic once. For a while, he was a motorcycle messenger. And he was delivering a message from one post to the other within England at the time. Most of the time he was not in England, but for a very short period of time he was actually in England. And he was carrying a message on his motorcycle, and he got lost. And he stopped in a small village in the north of England, and he asked for directions with his very strong German accent. And the people went running, screaming, feeling that the Germans had landed. So he caused a panic in this community, yeah. But he wasn't discriminated against, no. I mean, people understood that there was a difference between German Jews and Germans.
Did you practice your faith? Did you go to the synagogue in Britain?
We lived in the north of England. We lived in London for 1 year before we came here, but we lived in the north of England where we were the only Jewish family, we were in a little town called Bishop Auckland. And I was the only Jewish kid in the school, so there wasn't a synagogue. That wasn't possible. And there was no separation of church and state in England in those days. So every day there would be services in the auditorium, but the teacher would read an announcement that all Jews were to remain in their seats while everyone else went to the auditorium. I was the only Jew, but they read that every day.
Did you feel discriminated against?
Yeah, I did. Especially when I would sometimes get hit across the back of the legs by the teacher because she would ask me whether I was ready to accept Jesus as my Lord yet. So yeah, I felt discriminated against. Yeah.
Then you find yourself over in the United States. What did your dad do here then?
Initially, both of my parents worked in factories, minimum wage laborers. My dad worked as a cutter in a clothing factory. My mother worked in a box factory. Then my dad started working in a department store in downtown Rochester and worked his way up to be men's department manager, then assistant store manager, and then finally he was a manager of a department store called Gem. It was a government employees market. It was a nationwide sort of chain. It's out of business now, but he was a manager of one of those stores, and then he became a regional manager of Joann Fabric. He was actually, when he retired, he was the East Coast manager of Joann Fabric. But that was only later. When I was going to school and medical school, we were poor. They were, as I said, minimum wage. So they did better later on.
What was the aha moment for you when you decided you'd want to go to medical school?
I'm not sure there was one aha moment. I sort of knew in high school already that's what I was going to do.
Given your the experience of your dad in Germany, the fact that the family which survived the Holocaust, having lost so many folks, did you see where that was an influence on you, either going into medical school, even areas of which you chose, the fields within which you chose?
It probably did. I never actually thought it through consciously, but I'm certain that it did have an impact and influenced my decisions, sure.
So if I'm sitting here and I had your professional credentials, of which I clearly don't, what would I be asking you to try to ferret through that whole analysis?
I can't help you there, Greg. I don't know.
I wish I did. Come on. So the chosen field, you did your medical, where'd you do your medical studies then?
I went to medical school in Syracuse. Then I went to University of Rochester for my internship and residency, and then I was on the faculty of the medical school in Rochester.
As you proceeded down there, were there areas within which your professional field you found kind of a niche for you, more of a comfort zone?
Yeah, actually I started off in pediatrics, and I loved the kids, but I thought I'd have trouble with the mothers. So, I found I did
It's like being a baseball coach. That's the same thing.
I took a rotation with a child psychiatrist, and I found that absolutely fascinating. And I found the human mind a little more fascinating than pediatrics, so I switched.
What was it, the human mind, that kind of drove you there?
Well, I thought there's nothing more intriguing than the human mind and human behavior.
And as you were progressed, did you find your field of interest sort of narrowing in?
No, not really. Just the opposite. I found it broadening, because I used to teach my medical students and the residents who I worked with, that they must not forget their identity as physicians, that is, the psychiatric residents. So I tried to maintain my identity as a physician, and I would always take internal medicine courses and primary care courses and so forth, just to try and keep up. So I tried to broaden my view, not restrict it.
We're going to see in a few minutes a video of you and really the issue revolving around aspartame. How did you kind of get into that whole area of research?
It began really with a patient. And interesting, it began, well, my working with that patient began when I was on the faculty of the University of Rochester. And the patient, coincidentally, was a Chautauquan, probably a Chautauquan that many of you knew. She's no longer living. She's deceased now. She actually gave me permission to use her name, but I'm not comfortable doing that, really. But she had an experience that I could only attribute to aspartame. She had a sudden grand mal seizure. And this was a woman who had a long history of depression. She was, as I said, a Chautauquan, but she had, through marriage, her cousin was my boss, was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Rochester, a very well-known, internationally respected psychiatrist by the name of Lyman Wynn. And Lyman asked me if I would take care of his cousin, who was a Chautauquan, and she came down from Chautauqua to Rochester to see me. She had a long, long history of depression, had been treated unsuccessfully by an analyst. She had a very, very classic major depression, which responded beautifully to a simple antidepressant, something called imipramine, tofranil. We don't use that very much anymore, but it was very effective. She did very well, and I saw her for many years. When I left the university, I then actually came to Jamestown, because Jamestown General recruited me to be chief of psychiatry at Jamestown General Hospital, a hospital that no longer exists, but you probably know of it for many years. Anyway, this woman who had a history of depression, had never been manic, suddenly, 12 years after I had started taking care of her, had a manic episode and a grand mal seizure. She was then in her 50s. Epilepsy doesn't start in the 50s. And she'd been on an antidepressant for 12 years. Somebody who's basically bipolar, you give them an antidepressant, you'll trigger a manic episode. That had never happened. So it didn't make sense to me that this woman who had no history of seizures, no history of a manic episode, suddenly had a grand mal seizure and a manic episode. So I did some detective work with her. What was different in her life? And the only thing that was different was that she decided she was too heavy and needed to go on a diet. And she'd been consuming a lot of soda. She suddenly switched to something called Crystal Light, which was aspartame. It's still on the market. Some of you might know of it. And she was consuming massive amounts of it. And so I started to look at the biochemistry of this new artificial sweetener. I don't want to go into all the chemistry now, but it made sense to me that it would have changed her seizure threshold, allowing for a grand mal seizure, and would have also enabled a manic episode because of the changes in the brain chemistry. So I wrote a paper about that, and that's how I got into this field.
Just for the camera, could you describe just briefly what is aspartame?
Aspartame is what's known as a dipeptide of a methyl ester of a dipeptide. Those of you who've had some chemistry, a methyl ester is an organic salt. And this particular organic salt is the methyl ester of phenylalanine and aspartic acid. These are two amino acids. The companies that use it make a big point of saying these are natural amino acids, natural substances. They occur in nature. In nature, they're always part of a long protein chain. They're not isolated the way they are in aspartame. So it's very, very different when you take these two isolated amino acids, and in particular, take a methyl ester of those two amino acids. It flips the what's called catecholamine-indolamine ratio in the brain. Again, if somebody's interested, I'll be happy to discuss that at length with you, but I'm not going to do that here now.
And we would know that if we were buying it off the shelf as sort of NutraSweet.
You'd know it as NutraSweet, yes, equal. Most diet products contain it, whether it's Diet Pepsi, Diet Coke. Now some of the companies are trying to move away from it, and they're using things like Splenda, which is sucralose. That's a chlorinated hydrocarbon. I haven't done any research with that, but you could predict from the fact that it is a chlorinated hydrocarbon that it's toxic.
So as you're doing this research, you then do a paper.
I did a paper, and actually the person who reviewed that paper was Richard Wortman, who was chief of neurosciences at MIT, chairman of the Division of Brain Sciences at MIT. And he called me and he asked me if I had any other patients with seizures. I didn't at the time, but at the time I happened to have been president of the Jamestown Medical Society. So I asked my colleagues in Jamestown to be on the lookout for people with unexplained seizures. And I got lots of responses. An awful lot of folks were sent to me who had seizures that couldn't be accounted for. And when I looked at their histories, a lot of these folks had been taking in massive amounts of aspartame. So I got back in touch with Richard Wortman, and he asked me if I'd be willing to present a paper on seizures and aspartame at an MIT conference. MIT had organized a conference. Actually, I've got the book here. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. There was a conference that MIT organized in Washington, D.C., actually, on dietary phenylalanine and brain function. And he asked me to write it. I gave a paper at that conference, and then I wrote a chapter in this book on seizures. So I wrote the chapter on seizures. If anybody's really interested in the biochemistry, you can look at it in the book.
And then that takes on a life of its own. I mean,
it does, yeah, it does take on a life of its own. And there was a lot of criticism of what I had written, because both this chapter, well, my initial paper was based on a single case report. Okay, that used to be very important in medicine, but in recent years, the individual case report has really been denigrated. It's not respected. What's respected are double-blind studies. And case reports are felt to be anecdotal. And even my reports on the seizures, although there were a lot of patients, nevertheless, it was basically anecdotal material. Patients who'd had seizures that I could explain in no other way aside from their use of aspartame. But that's anecdotal. So there was so much criticism about my statements that were based on anecdotal material that I decided to do a double-blind study. The double-blind study is what got me onto 60 Minutes.
So,
Pardon me?
You were in Jamestown doing this.
No. I was then in a medical school faculty in Ohio. I was professor and chairman of psychiatry at a medical school called Neo-UCOM. That's basically Kent State's medical school.
So, based on your work, aspartame becomes the subject of a 60 Minutes piece.
Yes.
Set the scene, and then before we go to watch the movie.
Yeah, I'm glad I've got an opportunity to set the scene, because I was really upset over what you're not going to see in this video. See, I got a call one day after my paper was published. I did a double-blind study on adverse reactions to aspartame, okay? And after the publication of that, I got a call from somebody identifying himself as Mike Wallace to my secretary. And initially I said, some sort of a spoof, it's a joke. And she put him on, and it was Mike Wallace on the telephone, saying that they wanted to do a story on aspartame, and would I help them put it together? And then he put on the producer of the piece, Isidore Rossmarin. I then worked with Isidore primarily, Isidore being the producer of the piece, and Don Hewitt, the producer of 60 Minutes, and Mike Wallace, for a little over a year. I mean, we had conversations literally every single day. And Don Hewitt did not want to do the story. He and I argued constantly over this. I mean, he called me all sorts of names. He had a vicious tongue. He really was a nasty man in many ways. He felt that they were going to be sued by the industry. And Mike Wallace very much wanted to do the story. So they argued a lot over this. And Mike assured me that the story would be done. But I'm distressed over what you'll see, because you won't see what was really very, very important to me. There are several messages that I wanted to convey in the piece. Okay? I wanted, first of all, to talk about seizures. You know, I had worked with not many, but several commercial pilots who had seizures in the cockpit, which turned out to, I'm convinced, were aspartame related. People had no seizure disorders who suddenly started drinking massive amounts of diet drinks and had seizures in the cockpit. This obviously has major ramifications if you're a pilot. Okay, so I really wanted to get the story out about the impact that this has on seizure threshold. Not that it causes seizures in everybody, but somebody who already has a low threshold and then takes in aspartame can have overt seizure activity. I also wanted to talk about the impact of aspartame on people with mood disorders. And Mike Wallace and I talked at length about his own history of depression. He acknowledged to me that if it were not for Zoloft, he wouldn't be alive. He had a suicidal depression. Okay? And we talked about that, and that was going to be in the piece. And I was thrilled that he was willing to talk about his own depressive history. And, you know, he didn't take aspartame, but had he consumed a lot of aspartame, I'm convinced he would have been a lot worse, and his Zoloft might not have worked as well as it did. So I was thrilled when he talked about that, and I assumed that that was also going to be in the piece. There was something else too. There was a third point that I've forgotten now that was important to me that was not in the piece. Well, anyway, we'll have to. What was in the piece, you'll see. Well, yes. What transpired was that we put together what I thought was a beautiful. You know, it's only 14 minutes or so of a segment on 60 Minutes. We'd put together what I thought was a really meaningful story. And then 1 week before the segment was to air, a fellow by the name of John Olney, a man that a colleague of mine really, also a psychiatrist, but he was a neuroscientist at Washington University. He published a paper on aspartame and brain tumors. And Don Hewitt felt that this was fancier, this was more significant than my material. So they cut out much of everything that I had to say about seizures, everything that I had to say about mood disorders and about Mike Wallace's depression. That was all cut out. You'll see what was left, and that's not that much. Okay, so I was very, very unhappy when it aired. I mean, I'm in the piece, but the important points that I wanted to make were cut out. Don Hewitt was thrilled to do that, I'm sure, because he and I had tangled. But Mike Wallace didn't, you know, maybe he didn't want his, but it was very beautifully done, I thought. His statements about his own depression And I thought that that was very meaningful, and it's all cut to make room for John Olney's piece. Well, you'll see it.
Well, talk about Mike Wallace. You obviously met him.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about the person.
I was terrified of being interviewed by Mike Wallace. You know, I'd seen Mike and his aggressive style. Actually, the night before we taped the interview, and we spent all day on the interview. I mean, that was a long, you know, they cut it, obviously, but I spent the whole night before that taping, I was awake. I couldn't sleep at all, anticipating being grilled by Mike Wallace, you know. I expected he might assume some of Don Hewitt's personality or something. But Mike Wallace was fun to work with. He was actually a real gentleman. When we left at the taping, you know, he showed me the entire 60-minute set. He walked out, he put his arm around my shoulder, you know, his arm around me when we walked out. And he said, "Now don't worry, Ralph, it will be shown. I'll get Don Hewitt calmed down." So I enjoyed working with him. He was fun to work with.
Well, let's show it.
Better known by its brand names NutraSweet or Equal, aspartame is the most popular sugar substitute in the world.
I believe that aspartame is one of the safest food ingredients ever approved by the Food and Drug Administration.
But Dr. John Olney, who has been studying aspartame's effects on the brain for more than 20 years, disagrees. Dr. Olney does not say flat out that aspartame is responsible for the rise in brain tumors, but he does believe that it's the most likely suspect. Last month, the Journal of Neuropathology and Experimental Neurology published a scientific paper that says, in effect, that the ingestion of the widely used artificial sweetener called aspartame, better known as NutraSweet or Equal, may just be responsible for what the authors say is a dramatic increase in the number of people who develop brain tumors. In recent weeks, there's been a spate of media activity about this because a small but outspoken group of consumer advocates and researchers have become more vocal about what they say may be aspartame's adverse effects. These consumer groups and scientists are not calling for a ban, but they are asking the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to take another hard look at aspartame.
We're talking about a compound that millions of people are consuming on a regular basis. Children are a particular concern, and of course pregnant women are of special concern.
Dr. Deborah Davis is a leading epidemiologist who serves on the faculty of the Strang Cornell Cancer Prevention Center. She's published widely on the environmental causes of brain cancer. Is brain cancer mortality increasing in industrial countries?
Without any question it is.
Why?
We don't know why. I mean, that's the thing that we've been very concerned about. There are multiple factors we have to look at, but one of them may be, for some people, increased consumption of aspartame.
Better known by its brand names NutraSweet or Equal, aspartame is the most popular sugar substitute in the world. Since the FDA approved it back in 1981, it has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's now being used in thousands of products, from tabletop sweeteners to children's vitamins to diet soft drinks. What most consumers don't know is that aspartame's approval was one of the most contested in FDA history. Consumers have reported more than 7,000 adverse reactions to the FDA, ranging from dizziness to headaches to seizures. But the makers say it is the most tested food additive ever and is safe for the tens of millions who use it worldwide.
I believe that aspartame is one of the safest food ingredients ever approved by the Food and Drug Administration.
Dr. Virginia Weldon is head of public policy at Monsanto, which owns the NutraSweet Kelco company.
I believe it's safe for any American or anyone around the world to drink product containing aspartame.
But Dr. John Olney, who has been studying aspartame's effects on the brain for more than 20 years, disagrees. He is a neuroscientist at Washington University School of Medicine. His new study analyzes U.S. brain cancer data in the years before and since aspartame's approval.
We've found that in the last 8 or 9 years, which is about 3 to 5 years after aspartame was approved, there's been a striking increase in the incidence of malignant brain tumors.
Dr. Olney does not say flat out that aspartame is responsible for the rise in brain tumors, but he does believe that his analysis of the data shows that it's the most likely suspect, because he says many researchers have discounted other environmental factors. And Olney says the same types of aggressive brain tumors that showed up in the aspartame animal studies over 20 years ago are now increasing in the American human population.
You're not calling for a ban on aspartame from the market right now, is that correct?
No, I'm not saying that aspartame has been proven to cause brain tumors. I'm saying that there's enough basis to suspect aspartame that it needs to be reassessed. FDA needs to reassess it, and this time around, FDA should do it right.
We believe that based upon all the information that we've reviewed to date, that this is a safe product.
Dr. Michael Friedman is an FDA Deputy Commissioner. He and his boss, Dr. David Kessler, were not involved in the 1981 aspartame approval, but they do stand firmly behind the FDA's okay of the sweetener. And they maintain that brain tumors have decreased slightly in the past few years.
There's no evidence there that challenges, in my mind, the safety of aspartame. Looking very carefully at Dr. Olney's paper, it's not a convincing line of evidence.
Aspartame was discovered in the mid-60s at G.D. Searle, the Chicago drug company. Searle was bought by Monsanto and then was spun off to form the NutraSweet Kelco company. The FDA originally approved aspartame back in 1974, but FDA investigators soon found serious problems in some of the studies that Searle had submitted to the FDA, and so a task force was organized to investigate many of Searle's tests.
There were some very serious deficiencies in the conduct of some of those experiments.
Dr. Eric Millstone is a food safety expert at the University of Sussex in England. He's been a critic of Britain's approval of the sweetener for over a decade. He says that Searle's tests in the early 70s were so flawed, there is simply no way to be sure that aspartame is safe.
Well, for example, a rat died during the course of an experiment, but apparently that rat was not then carefully dissected to see whether there was any evidence that the compound might have killed the rat, and there were many other deficiencies in the conduct of these tests. Tumors appeared in some of the animals and they were simply cut out and discarded, not reported. There were occasions when antibiotics were administered, but that was not reported.
All of this by G.D. Searle?
G.D. Searle and some of the companies working under contract to G.D. Searle.
Because the FDA task force found so many discrepancies in Searle's data, in late '75, the agency put the approval on hold before aspartame could hit the market. The FDA commissioner back then called the test at best sloppy and said their investigation revealed a pattern of conduct which compromises the scientific integrity of the studies.
According to the FDA themselves, Searle, in making their presentation to the FDA, had willfully misrepresented the facts and had withheld some of the facts that they knew would possibly jeopardize the approval of the product.
Former Senator Howard Metzenbaum's staff investigated the aspartame approval process. Since he's retired from the Senate, he has become chairman of the Consumer Federation of America.
The FDA officials themselves were so upset that they sent the file to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago for the purpose of presenting it to the grand jury as to whether or not there should be indictments. It wasn't presented. It was delayed.
Samuel Skinner, the U.S. attorney who led the grand jury probe, withdrew from the case while he was in job discussions with Searle's Chicago law firm, Sidley & Austin, a job that he later accepted. The investigation stalled, and the statute of limitations on the aspartame charges ran out. As a result, the investigation was dropped. Skinner denies any responsibility for this. Meanwhile, an FDA field team inspected Searle's labs. Their report was highly critical of the way that Searle conducted key animal feeding studies, saying that the chemical being tested was not properly mixed with the food, thus allowing the rats to eat around the big chunks of the test substance.
The critics say that because aspartame's approval was based on Searle's flawed tests, they say, well, then how can we be certain that aspartame is safe?
The critical question is not whether there were sloppiness or mistakes made in recording data. That clearly occurred. The scientists looking at that information decided that the basic strength of the conclusions remains intact.
So even though they mixed up the animals, even though they failed to tag the animals, even though they used decomposed tissue, even though.
I don't think you're characterizing that exactly correctly, but the question really is, do those issues detract from the basic solidity of the conclusion?
Dr. Millstone says that the teams which reviewed those Searle studies looked only at their statistical validity and did not examine safety issues.
Teams of investigators were given very narrow briefs, very narrow terms of reference, which essentially ensured that they never addressed the most important question.
Which was?
Were the tests properly conducted? Were the tests honestly reported? And was it possible to be confident that a compound is safe?
In 1980, more than 5 years after the controversy began, questions still remained about aspartame. And so the FDA had 2 separate panels of experts evaluate the cancer issues. Both panels concluded that the agency should not approve aspartame until more tests were done because of concerns about brain tumors. But in 1981, Dr. Arthur Hall Hayes was appointed as President Reagan's new FDA commissioner.
And that commissioner of the FDA, overruling 3 outside scientists and 3 internal scientists working in the FDA process, who said it should not be marketed. That commissioner overruled these people and said, I'm going to let it go on the market in spite of these rulings.
Attorney Jim Turner is a consumer advocate with Citizens for Health. He helped get the FDA to ban cyclamate, another artificial sweetener. He has been challenging the FDA's aspartame approval for over 20 years.
The issue is that it did cause brain tumors in animals. The Public Board of Inquiry that was convened by the FDA of outside experts ruled that it should not be marketed until the cancer question was resolved.
2 years after Commissioner Hayes approved aspartame for dry products, he approved it for soft drinks, after which use of the sweetener skyrocketed. Hayes left the agency a few months later and took a job with Burson Marsteller, the PR firm for Searle. He has not responded to our requests for an interview on or off camera. The so-called revolving door and the FDA's approval process were 2 issues Senator Metzenbaum asked the General Accounting Office, the GAO, to investigate for his 1987 hearings on aspartame. The GAO did not examine scientific or safety issues, but they found no improprieties with the revolving door issues, and they said the FDA had adequately followed its food additive approval process.
The GAO looked into all of that, and they saw nothing wrong with this so-called revolving door.
I'm not saying that there was something legally wrong. What may be legally right might be ethically questionable.
Some scientists allege that the industry tries to influence research. Dr. Ralph Walton, a professor of psychiatry at Northeastern Ohio University's College of Medicine, recently did a survey of aspartame studies. He found that the results of industry-sponsored research turned out very differently from the non-industry-sponsored studies.
I looked at the medical literature addressing the safety of aspartame. I found 164 studies. 74 were funded by the NutraSweet industry. Every single one of them attested to the safety of aspartame. Of the 90 independently funded studies, 83 identified a problem.
And what are you saying?
I think it's inappropriate for researchers to have a vested interest in the outcome of their research.
No scientist is going to sacrifice his or her reputation just because of where the sponsor is or where the money comes from. That would be a very foolish thing to do.
Dr. Weldon, the spokesperson for Monsanto, insists that the evidence for aspartame's safety is overwhelming.
In the last 23 years, the FDA has looked at the aspartame data at least 26 times. Most recently, in July of 1996, the FDA granted a general use petition.
In everything?
For all foods.
Right. But the FDA said aspartame is safe. You say it's safe. On the other hand, there are all kinds of scientists who say we don't know enough, we're not sure that it's safe, and Olney, who is a very distinguished researcher and scientist, says it needs more testing.
Well, I think it's really important to understand that what I say isn't important. It's what the National Cancer Institute scientists say that's important. And they've looked at this data, too. In fact,
She says that both the FDA and the National Cancer Institute maintain that Dr. Olney is misinterpreting the cancer data.
even the most respected and distinguished investigators occasionally make mistakes. And in this instance, I think Dr. Olney has made a mistake.
Epidemiologist Dr. Deborah Davis disagrees.
So when we have evidence that something produces cancer in animals, we'd better pay attention to that evidence. That's a basic tenet of public health. And the question of how much evidence is enough is not a scientific question. It's a policy question. That's what the FDA has to deal with.
Haven't enough questions been raised, Dr. Friedman, about the validity of some of these cancer tests, that the FDA might want to take another hard look?
We've looked very hard at this. We're continuing to look hard at it. But I must say to you that the human data, the animal data, the laboratory data that has been proposed as reasons to reconsider so far are not sufficiently convincing.
The FDA says they will carefully consider any future adverse data on aspartame that they find convincing enough to warrant investigation. Meantime, NutraSweet is being test marketed in China, a potential market of about 1 billion people.
Yeah, I was just starting to say that Eric Millstone and I both testified before Parliament a couple of years ago. That was a fun experience. We testified before the House of Commons.
And what was the result of that? That was the British were reviewing this as well.
They were reviewing this as well. Actually, I was contacted by a fellow by the name of Roger Williams, who's a PhD MP from Wales. And he got into this whole aspartame business because of one of his constituents. One of his constituents was a science teacher who had a son who had sudden grand mal seizures, anyway, a 10-year-old boy. And it turned out that the only way to explain his seizures was by his ingestion of aspartame. His mother, being a science teacher, did her own little experiment with him. She stopped the all aspartame and his no seizures. She reintroduced it. And he had seizures again. So she was 100% convinced this was only because of aspartame. So she contacted her member of parliament, and then he looked at the issue, contacted me, and he actually wrote up a bill to be introduced into the House of Commons banning the use of aspartame in the United Kingdom. And he wanted me to help him put this together and get it through the House of Commons. So I went down there, spent a week in London with Mary. And we had a great time. He showed us, things that normally tourists don't get to see. So it was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, the bill failed. But we had something like 47 votes for it, which was quite more than I thought we'd get. But it still failed.
This aired in 1996.
Yeah.
The week after it aired, what was the response of most folks to your appearance?
Nothing. I was expecting that would be the end of aspartame. Obviously, it wasn't. This has been a very frustrating ride all of these years. My first paper on it was written, I think, in 1985 or 86, a long time ago. And our double-blind study was 1993, again, a long time ago. And unfortunately, ours was the only double-blind study involving human participants. And animals handle this substance very differently, so it's dangerous to extrapolate from animal data. But even the animal data is certainly worrisome.
I'm just reading the Wikipedia, that's my source of all knowledge. The European Food Safety Authority concluded in its 2013 reevaluation. Did you follow all that?
I was one of the people. I was called to testify at EFSA. I went to Parma for that consideration. When we were really looking at it, they asked me to testify. But while I was in the waiting area, you know, waiting to testify before EFSA, I saw all of these folks who had industry-sponsored research. You know, I knew what they were going to say. And it looks as though there is just this overwhelming amount of research indicating how safe it is. But you know, so much of it is overtly fraudulent. They didn't show much on the piece of the chart that I put together for them. I'll pass this around. Actually, I made slides of this, but after Steve Tigner's wonderful slides, I would be too embarrassed to show little black and white slides and get you all bored. But I'll pass this around because this shows the chart of the industry-sponsored studies and the independent studies. But it also shows, and Mike didn't get into this for some reason, how the number of studies attesting to safety is padded. You know, whenever you submit a paper for publication, you have to state that it's not being submitted anywhere else. I looked at at the time that I did this, put this together for 60 Minutes, I had medical students, fortunately, who could work with me, so I had pretty cheap labor. And we found there were 560 some odd studies about aspartame at that point in the literature. So I had my students, you saw them around the table there, you know, those were my medical students. And I had them go through these 566 studies. And we found some interesting things that, in fact, there are not nearly the number of studies attesting to safety that you would think, because what's happened is that the industry-funded studies have been submitted to multiple journals and sometimes change just one word in the title or the order of the authors. So one study gets reported maybe 8 or 9 times, submitted to different journals, exactly word for word the same study, and I've documented that in this thing. Okay? And you can find even in supposedly very, very different studies the same set of data out to the 4th and 5th decimal point. Supposedly very different studies, and yet they've got exactly the same numbers, so clearly it's all cooked. So it's fraudulent. The evidence that's out there, the evidence that the FDA is using to stamp its approval of aspartame is based on fraud perpetrated by the industry. It's something that makes me very, very angry, and it's still out there after all these years. Unfortunately, there are a number of people, you know, aside from me, screaming about this, but unfortunately there's this whole anti-aspartame movement on the internet, and many of these folks are making claims that are outrageous, that are not based on science, and I sort of hesitate when my name is used in some of these internet things, because it's not, a lot of it's not good science. I told Greg just a couple of days ago that I was surprised when somebody sent me a comic strip of me. I mean, I had nothing to do with putting this together, but there's a comic strip out on the internet. I made a few copies there. I can, well,
can you bring it over?
Those, see that comic strip there? You can pass that out. I made a few, probably not enough for everybody, but.
Give me one and I'll just talk about it. And so Doctors Against Aspartame.
I've never heard of that group, if there is such a group. I've never heard of this person who did this comic strip. I had no knowledge of it until this last weekend. Somebody sent it to me. It's on the internet, apparently.
Was that Betty Martini? Was that?
Yeah, she's the one who sent it to me. Mm-hmm. I don't think she put it together. She's one of these people who makes outrageous claims, and I really don't like my name associated with Betty. I mean, she's done a lot to popularize the notion that there's something wrong with aspartame. But, you know, she calls herself doctor. She's not a physician. She's a doctor of humility, whatever that means.
In my world, I don't know any of those.
And she makes often absolutely outrageous statements. So I really want to distance myself from this whole internet movement.
Wait a minute, but you saw the cartoon.
Yeah.
Does it appropriately?
Yeah, that one does quote me appropriately. I mean, I'm often quoted incorrectly. This one does quote me correctly.
An article you wrote called Aspartame and Psychiatric Disorders by Ralph Walton, MD, September 20th, 2006. And let me just read the conclusion. This is almost 10 years ago. We are not sophisticated enough at this point in time to fully understand all the implications of the neurochemical changes induced by aspartame but as a busy clinician, I see the profound impact on patients' lives on a daily basis. It can both produce and aggravate depression. In certain patients, it can trigger manic episodes. It can produce or aggravate panic attacks. Some of my patients have experienced a complete cessation of panic attacks and needed no further treatment after they completely eliminated aspartame from their diet. Certain schizophrenic patients have experienced fewer auditory hallucinations or needed less antipsychotic medication after the elimination of aspartame. And then you concluded, it is essential that there be much greater awareness of the hazards of this highly toxic substance. You feel that is your name been kind of affiliated now with that charge?
Yes. Yes.
And do you feel, here you are almost 10 years after this paper, but up here in Chautauqua Institution, that you are the go-to person for that message?
I don't know if I'm the go-to person, but I'm one of the people. There aren't that many of us, actually. Yeah, probably the world's, because, see, right now, when I wrote those earlier papers, I was focusing primarily on the two amino acids in aspartame, the phenylalanine and aspartate, and the changes that can cause. But I probably neglected the methyl ester component. The methyl ester component is degraded into methanol and then formaldehyde. Methanol, obviously, is very, very toxic. And the world's expert on methanol is a fellow by the name of biochemist by the name of Woodrow Monty. And he and I have teamed up. We've followed each other's papers over the last 30 years. And we've teamed up now to do a study together. Alice has that study right now. I'm asking Alice to help me edit that. So it's not been published yet. We're hopeful that it will be published. But we both feel that dietary methanol, produced largely by aspartame, is a factor in the rise in autism.
What's the process? You do a paper, you know, a collaborative paper subject to Alice's review, and what happens next? I mean, you submit it to the...
Yeah, you submit it to medical journals, and it's very, very difficult today to get material published in the major journals. You know, they're all inundated with papers. If you're a medical school faculty, it's publish or perish sort of thing. You have to publish. So there's tremendous pressure on full-time faculty to publish.
Then is there a review panel?
What happens is that they're sent, yes, if I submit a paper, now when Alice gives me the go-ahead, we will submit it, say, to the American Journal of Psychiatry, and then that journal will send it to experts in the field, to reviewers, peer reviewers. They'll send it to at least 3 or 4 different reviewers, people who've published in the same area, and they will send back their comments to the journal, and some decision will be made. The vast majority of papers that are submitted are never published.
Do you get to see their reviews?
Yes.
So
you get to see their comments, yes.
Does that ever change even how you approach the paper? Is this sort of a critique that you may go back and say, well, maybe we should focus more on this aspect as opposed to that?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. You take into account the comments of the reviewers, certainly.
Will you, if one does not get them published in a medical, would you publish it online?
Maybe. I mean, Woody and I have talked about that if we don't get published in a major journal, we might go to one of the so-called open access online journals, yes. Because we want to get the word out there. We're going to try for the major journals first. And I've been fortunate enough so far that each of my papers has been published in a major journal. But we feel this is an important study that we're doing now on autism. And that word needs to get out there. So yes, we may publish it online, but we're going to try for the major journals first.
You've been carrying this message for some time now.
Yep, since it first was introduced.
And yet legislatively, administratively, we all can go and buy NutraSweet and so on and so forth. Do you get discouraged?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, it's been a long haul, a very long time. And I do get frustrated. I mean, I see the damage that it does, and it is so frustrating to see that and to feel powerless to change it. I mean, I'm screaming as loudly as I can, but nothing changes. The power of this industry is incredible. I mean, all right, I mentioned Woodrow Monty. He's the PhD biochemist. He and I are working together now. You know, he's now Professor Emeritus at Arizona State University. For many years, he had a large laboratory at Arizona State, and he was head of the Food Sciences Division of Arizona State. And after he published some of his papers, anti-aspartame papers, his laboratory at Arizona State was firebombed. His home was burned to the ground, and it was felt to be arson. Okay? Fortunately, I haven't had anything like that happen to me, but people have suggested I have somebody else start my car.
Have the pharmaceutical folks reached out to you?
No. I mean, pharmaceuticals, well, you raise an interesting point. Many pharmaceuticals, interestingly, Dilantin, which is a major anticonvulsant, is made with aspartame in it. Isn't that something? They put sweeteners in some pills so that you don't get the aftertaste, or if you do, it's a sweet taste. Many medications have got aspartame in them. Yes?
I have a question. Is there any way to get the aspartame out of your system, or does it always stay in your system?
The aspartame doesn't stay in your system, but the metabolite formaldehyde, we can't get rid of formaldehyde. So even though the amount is small, it's cumulative. So the longer you consume aspartame, the more formaldehyde you have in your system. It's one of the very few substances that our liver simply cannot detoxify. Yeah, you pickle yourself with it, essentially.
What?
Is there any tipping point as to the quantity needed to cause adverse effects?
Yeah, that's a good question, but the FDA says that a safe level is 50 milligrams per kilogram per day. Okay, when we did our double-blind study, I decided that we had to, in order to make sure that our subjects were safe, we had to stay below that. So what I did in that study was to give our subjects 30 milligrams per kilogram per day. That's the equivalent of maybe 7 or 8 Diet Cokes. Okay, it's a lot, but it's still within the realm of what people do in fact consume. And we had profound adverse effects. It's mentioned actually in that comic strip. I used as a subject one of my PhD psychiatric unit administrator, Bob Marcus. He was a PhD psychologist. And he was one of my guinea pigs. He volunteered to be a control in the study. And he was, at the time, a 41-year-old, very, very healthy guy, worked out all the time, no health problems at all. He suffered an intraocular bleed and a detached retina. He lost the sight in one eye. You know, methanol is highly toxic to the eye. One of the things that happens when alcoholics, say, drink wood alcohol is they lose their vision. We had a nurse who was also a subject in our study have an intraocular bleed also. So we had 2 people with intraocular bleeding episodes during the course of the study. The IRB, you know, when you do human experimentation, you have to have a so-called institutional review board monitor the safety of the study. They put a stop to the study at that point because they thought it was too dangerous. Fortunately, we'd had enough people go through the study that it was still statistically significant. But we had to stop it midstream because of the severity. And several patients said they'd been poisoned. Okay? So the adverse reactions were severe. And that was at 30 milligrams per kilogram per day. As I said, that's like 7 or 8. So we had some severe reactions at 7 or 8. You know, the industry uses what we do know about this to their advantage in setting up studies. We know, for example, that people who report migraines with aspartame typically need about 3 or 4 days of continuous use before they get a migraine. Okay? Unlike some other migraine triggers, which can be immediate. So what the industry-funded studies do is they give aspartame for 1 or 2 days, not 3, and then say there's no migraines associated with it. You know, they set things up so that they know ahead of time what the outcome is going to be. Yeah, Carol?
Stevia.
Pardon me?
How about stevia?
Stevia is safe. That's from a plant. You know, that's a very natural substance. That's, as far as we know, that's perfectly safe.
Well, talk a little bit about that book. I mean,
well, okay. This is when I was in Jamestown many, many years ago. She was a patient of mine, and one day she told me that she was going to write, as we were sort of getting towards integration, she was doing better. She said, Dr. Walton, I think I want to write a book about all of this. Now, I hear that a lot from patients. You know, usually I'll listen to it and sort of think that they're never going to get this into a book, or that, you know, so I'll try to politely move on to something else. But she was such a gifted woman. I thought her story was so unusual that I really encouraged her to write the book. And she did, and sent it to Harper & Row. They bought the book. And they paid me to, the only time I've been paid for anything I've written was this. They paid me to write the foreword. I got a check from Harper & Row for $2,000 for writing the foreword to the book. It's the only time I've ever been paid for all of this.
It's available on Amazon.
so what was the basic premise, though, of the study? I mean, what is it that caught your attention to actually see this case through?
Well, I find multiple, you know, what we now call dissociative identity disorder. Back then, when I was working with her, we called it MPD, multiple personality disorder. And she was a multiple, but it was so fascinating. I worked closely with her internist on this because she had laboratory findings that were absolutely impossible to explain. As Laura mentioned, you know, when one alter got measles, the others didn't. But the lab tests were different depending on which alter was out at the time the blood was drawn. That was the most spooky thing I've ever seen in my life. I've never encountered anything quite like that before.
Did you write up anything about that?
No, I didn't. I wrote in the foreword that I knew that that story had to be told, but I wrote in the foreword that the person to write that and to tell it is Kit herself. So I did not write that one up.
Did you stay in touch with her?
The last time I had any word from her was, when did I get that invitation? I got an invitation to her wedding, maybe 10 years ago. I got an invitation to her wedding. You know, I'm not totally retired yet. I still work. I still do telemedicine, so I don't have all the time in the world, but I'm still just in the organizing process of that. I'm not very far along with it.
You and Mary have become major parts of the Chautauqua community.
Yes.
What caused you to do that?
Gosh, the first time I saw Chautauqua, I fell in love with the place, with the whole idea of Chautauqua. I loved everything about it, and I've been involved for much of my life.
Now living here, right?
Now living here, yeah.
When you go to breakfast someplace, and somebody asks, you're at a crowd, 2, 3, 4 people, and somebody asks for NutraSweet, do you react to that?
Gosh, I try not to give them a lecture, you know, but sure I react. I think, oh no, you know, I just would love to have them reach for the sugar instead. But
this has been phenomenal. This has just been great, and thank you to Dr. Ralph Walton for making this paper.
yeah, thank you, Greg. Thank you. Appreciate it.